The dust devil swirled across the barren ranch yard, picking up tumbleweeds and depositing them against the weathered fence posts like nature's own collection of forgotten dreams. Marcus Thornfield watched it from his porch, boots crossed on the railing, coffee growing cold in his calloused hands. The September heat still clung to the Texas plains despite the late afternoon hour, and the cicadas had begun their evening symphony in the mesquite trees that dotted his property line. He'd been sitting in that same spot for the better part of 3 hours, same as he did most days since Catherine passed. The routine had become his anchor in a world that felt increasingly adrift. Wake at dawn, tend the horses, check the fence line, eat whatever canned goods remained in the pantry, and settle into this chair to watch the sun make its daily journey across the endless sky. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tomorrow would bring the same ritual, and the day after that, until time itself seemed to blur into one long unchanging moment. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles down the county road, and folks in Millbrook had long since stopped extending invitations to church socials or town meetings. They understood that some wounds needed tending in solitude, and Marcus Thornfield had made it clear through polite but firm declining that his grief was a private matter. The townspeople respected that, even if they worried about the man who'd once been the life of every community gathering, whose laughter could fill a room and whose stories could hold an audience spellbound until the early morning hours. But that was before the cancer took Catherine, before the treatments that promised hope but delivered only prolonged suffering, before the funeral where half the county showed up to pay their respects to a woman who'd taught 3 generations of children and never met a stranger she couldn't befriend. That was before Marcus discovered that a house could feel larger and emptier with each passing day, and that silence had a weight all its own. The coffee had gone stone cold when he first spotted them. 2 small figures moving along the distant fence line, their progress slow but determined against the backdrop of golden prairie grass. Marcus squinted, lifting a hand to shade his eyes from the slanting sunlight. Children, by the look of them, though what children would be doing out here in the middle of nowhere was beyond his understanding. The closest school was in town, and the bus route didn't come within 5 miles of his property. As they drew closer, details began to emerge from the heat shimmer. Identical children, he realized, with matching overalls and sun-bleached hair that caught the light like spun gold. They couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, walking with the kind of serious purpose that seemed oddly adult for their small frames. Between them, one of the children carried what appeared to be a chicken, holding it carefully against his chest as they navigated the uneven ground. Marcus lowered his boots from the railing and leaned forward, interest stirring for the first time in months. The last unexpected visitors to his ranch had been county officials checking on his well-being after concerned calls from townspeople who'd noticed his absence from the local diner where he'd once been a regular fixture. He'd assured them he was fine, just needed time, and they'd respected his privacy. But these weren't officials or concerned neighbors. These were children, alone and far from any reasonable destination. The twins continued their approach, never wavering from their direct path toward his house. As they crossed into his yard proper, Marcus could see that the chicken one of them carried was no ordinary barnyard fowl. A small brass bell hung from a leather cord around its neck, catching the sunlight and throwing tiny rainbows across the dust with each step the child took. The sound of the bell carried across the still air, a gentle chiming that seemed almost musical in the quiet of the late afternoon. Marcus stood, his movement causing the porch boards to creak in protest. The children stopped at the bottom of his steps, looking up at him with identical faces that held an unsettling mixture of innocence and ancient wisdom. Their eyes were the deep blue of a winter sky, and they regarded him with the kind of steady gaze that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. "You lost, kids," Marcus called down, his voice rusty from disuse. He couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken aloud to another human being, and the words felt strange in his throat. The twin holding the chicken stepped forward slightly, his small fingers gentle as he adjusted his grip on the bird. The bell chimed softly with the movement, a sound that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed. "Are you Marcus Thornfield?" the boy asked, his voice clear and certain despite his young age. Something cold settled in Marcus's stomach at hearing his name spoken by this strange child. "That's right," he answered slowly. "How do you know my name?" The second twin moved closer to his brother, their shoulders touching in a gesture that spoke of shared secrets and unspoken communication. "Our mama told us to find you," he said, his voice identical to his brother's in tone and cadence. "She said you'd help us when the time came." Marcus felt the world shift slightly beneath his feet, as if the ground itself had become uncertain. "Your mama," he repeated, tasting the words. "And who might that be?" The twins exchanged a look that held entire conversations, the kind of silent communication that only existed between people who'd shared every moment of their lives from birth. Then in perfect unison, they climbed the first step of his porch. The chicken in the boy's arms clucked softly, the bell around its neck chiming in harmony with the sound. "Elena Vasquez," said the first twin, never taking his eyes from Marcus's face. The name hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and sending his mind reeling back across 15 years of carefully buried memories. Elena, his Elena, with her dark hair that smelled of wildflowers and her laugh that could chase away the darkest storm clouds. Elena, who'd left Millbrook the day after graduation with promises to write that had lasted exactly 3 months before the letters stopped coming. Elena, who'd taken a piece of his heart with her that he'd never quite managed to replace, not even during his happy years with Catherine. "Elena Vasquez," Marcus repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The twins nodded in unison, their serious expressions never wavering. "She's our mama," the second twin confirmed, adjusting the chicken's position so the bell caught more of the fading sunlight. "And she told us something important about you." Marcus sank back into his chair, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. Elena had children, twin boys who looked nothing like her dark beauty but carried themselves with her unmistakable quiet strength. The implications hit him in waves, each one more staggering than the last. "Where is she?" he managed to ask, though part of him wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. The twins climbed another step, bringing them closer to his eye level. The chicken in the boy's arms seemed remarkably calm for a bird carried by a child, its bright eyes alert but unafraid. The bell continued its gentle chiming, a sound that was beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like some kind of signal. "That's why we're here," the first twin said, his small face grave with responsibility. "Mama's in trouble, and she needs your help." "What kind of trouble?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect that whatever had brought these children to his door was far more complicated than a simple request for assistance. The second twin reached into his overall pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn at the edges from frequent handling. He held it out to Marcus, who took it with hands that trembled slightly. The paper felt familiar beneath his fingers, the texture bringing back memories of summer evenings and stolen moments under the stars. Marcus unfolded the paper carefully, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a letter he'd written to Elena during their senior year of high school, full of teenage declarations of love and promises of forever. But it wasn't the letter that made his hands shake. It was what Elena had written in the margins, notes he'd never seen before in her careful handwriting. Marcus, the margin notes read, "If you're reading this, then the boys have found you and I'm either dead or as good as dead. The men who've been hunting me finally caught up, but I managed to hide the boys before they could take them too. What I discovered in the desert changes everything, and there are people who'll kill to keep it secret. The boys know where to find what I hid. Trust them, Marcus. Trust the bell. It's the key to everything." Marcus looked up from the letter to find both twins watching him intently, their blue eyes reflecting a knowledge far beyond their years. The chicken in the boy's arms shifted slightly, and the bell chimed again, the sound now carrying an almost urgent quality. "The bell," Marcus said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "What's special about the bell?" The twin holding the chicken smiled for the first time since their arrival, an expression that transformed his serious face into something almost angelic. "Mama found it in the old mine," he said, reaching up to gently touch the brass surface. "She said it belonged to your great-grandfather." Marcus's world tilted again as another piece of the puzzle fell into place. His great-grandfather, Jedediah Thornfield, had been a prospector who'd worked the desert mines in the 1890s. Family legend claimed he'd found something significant out there, something that had made him wealthy enough to buy the ranch that had been in the Thornfield family ever since. But Jedediah had taken his secrets to the grave, and the exact location of his strike had been lost to time. "She found Jedediah's mine?" Marcus asked, scarcely believing the words as they left his mouth. The second twin nodded gravely. "She found more than that," he said. "She found out why people wanted to keep it lost." Before Marcus could ask what that meant, the sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the evening air. A dust cloud rose from the county road, growing larger as whatever was causing it drew closer to his property. The twins immediately tensed, pressing closer together as the chicken in the boy's arms began to cluck with agitation, its bell chiming rapidly. "They found us," the first twin whispered, fear creeping into his voice for the first time. Marcus stood quickly, his protective instincts kicking in despite his confusion about the larger situation. "Who found you?" he demanded, moving to stand between the children and the approaching vehicle. "The same men who took Mama," the second twin said, his small hand reaching out to grip Marcus's shirt. "They've been following us for 3 days." The vehicle was close enough now that Marcus could make out details through the dust. A black SUV with tinted windows, the kind of official-looking transportation that spelled trouble in any rural community. It pulled into his yard with the confidence of people who were used to going wherever they pleased, regardless of property rights or local customs. 2 men emerged from the vehicle, both wearing dark suits despite the heat and dust. They had the kind of carefully neutral expressions that Marcus recognized from his years dealing with government bureaucrats and corporate representatives trying to buy mineral rights. But there was something harder about these men, something that suggested their business involved more than paperwork and negotiations. "Mr. Thornfield," the taller of the 2 men called out, approaching the porch with measured steps. "I'm Agent Morrison, this is Agent Collins. We're with the Department of Natural Resources. We understand you've had some unexpected visitors." Marcus kept his position between the agents and the twins, his every instinct screaming that these men represented danger. "Natural resources," he repeated. "Since when does DNR travel in pairs wearing suits?" Agent Morrison's smile was as cold as his eyes. "We're investigating some irregularities in mining claims in this area. Claims that may involve fraud and the theft of government property. We have reason to believe those children may have information relevant to our investigation." The twin holding the chicken moved closer to Marcus's leg, and he could feel the boy trembling despite his efforts to appear brave. The bell around the chicken's neck had fallen silent, as if even the bird understood the gravity of the situation. "These children are just kids," Marcus said firmly. "Whatever investigation you're conducting, they're not involved." Agent Collins stepped forward, his hand resting casually on something beneath his jacket. "Mr. Thornfield, I appreciate your desire to protect them, but this is a matter of national security. We need to question the children about their mother's activities." "Their mother's activities," Marcus repeated, buying time while his mind raced. Elena was in trouble, that much was clear, but national security, what had she discovered in that old mine that had drawn the attention of federal agents? The first twin tugged on Marcus's shirt, drawing his attention down to the boy's upturned face. "The bell," the child whispered, so quietly that only Marcus could hear. "When it rings at feeding time, everything changes." Marcus frowned, not understanding, but the twins' next words made his blood run cold. "Mama said if the bad men came, we should show you what the bell really does. But only if they try to take us away." Agent Morrison was growing impatient, his professional facade beginning to slip. "Mr. Thornfield, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Those children are coming with us either way." "Like hell they are," Marcus growled, his protective instincts fully engaged now. Whatever Elena had gotten herself into, whatever she'd discovered, these were her children. His mind kept circling back to the implications of that fact, but right now their safety was the only thing that mattered. The second twin moved to stand beside his brother, both boys now flanking Marcus like small soldiers preparing for battle. The chicken in the boy's arms seemed to sense the its feathers ruffling as it fixed the approaching agents with a surprisingly fierce stare. Agent Collins drew what Marcus now saw was a weapon, though he kept it pointed downward. "Sir, step away from the children."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"This doesn't have to get ugly." "Too late for that," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had once made him a natural leader in the community. "You're on my property threatening children. In Texas, that gives me certain rights." The agents exchanged glances, clearly not having expected resistance from a grieving widower who'd been living in isolation. They'd probably counted on him being too worn down by sorrow to put up a fight. They'd miscalculated. The first twin looked up at Marcus with those impossibly blue eyes. "The bell knows," he said cryptically. "Mama taught it to remember." As if responding to some unheard signal, the chicken suddenly spread its wings and crowed, a sound that seemed far too large and resonant to come from such a small bird. The bell around its neck began to chime, not with the gentle musical tones of before, but with a deep thrumming resonance that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The agents stopped their advance, confusion replacing confidence on their faces. Agent Morrison raised his hand to his ear, as if trying to hear something over a suddenly overwhelming noise, though to Marcus, the bells chiming seemed no louder than before. "What the hell?" Agent Collins muttered, swaying slightly as if the sound was affecting his balance. The twin holding the chicken stepped forward, his fear replaced by a strange kind of calm authority. "You can't take us," he said, his young voice carrying clearly over the bell's resonance. "The desert remembers. The mine remembers. And now the bell remembers too." Marcus felt something shift in the air around them, as if reality itself was bending slightly at the edges. The light seemed different, more golden and fluid, and the shadows cast by the setting sun appeared to move independently of their sources. Agent Morrison stumbled backward, his hand pressed to his temple. "Collins," he gasped, "we need to go, now." But Agent Collins was staring at the chicken with an expression of dawning horror. The bird's eyes had begun to glow with a soft golden light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the bells chiming. The light was hypnotic, beautiful, and utterly impossible. "The stories were true," Collins whispered, his weapon forgotten at his side. "The old prospector really did find something." The second twin moved to stand beside his brother, and together they began to walk down the porch steps toward the agents. The bells chiming grew stronger with each step, and Marcus could see that both men were now struggling to remain standing. "Please," Agent Morrison said, his earlier authority completely gone. "We'll leave. We won't bother you again." The first twin stopped directly in front of the agents, the glowing chicken calm in his arms. "Tell your bosses," he said in his clear young voice, "that Elena Vasquez's sons are under the protection of the Thornfield Ranch. Tell them the mine chooses its own guardians." The golden light from the chicken's eyes pulsed once brilliantly, and both agents stumbled backward as if pushed by an invisible force. They retreated to their SUV with undignified haste, Agent Collins fumbling with the keys while Agent Morrison collapsed into the passenger seat. The vehicle roared to life and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust and the smell of burning rubber in the evening air. Only when the sound of the engine had completely faded, did the chicken's eyes return to normal and the bell fall silent. Marcus stood on his porch, staring after the departed agents, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Magic. There was no other word for it. Whatever Elena had found in that old mine, it had given her sons and their unusual companion abilities that defied rational explanation. The twins turned back to him, their serious expressions returning as if the display of supernatural power had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. The chicken settled back into the boy's arms, preening its feathers with the casual air of a creature accustomed to being extraordinary. "They'll come back," the second twin said, matter-of-factly. "They always do." Marcus sank back into his chair, his mind reeling. "What exactly did your mother find in that mine?" The first twin climbed the porch steps to stand beside him, the chicken clucking softly in his arms. "She found your great-grandfather's secret," he said simply. "And now it's our secret too." "What kind of secret?" Marcus pressed, though he was beginning to suspect that the answer would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The second twin joined his brother on the porch, both boys settling cross-legged on the weathered boards as if they'd done so 100 times before. "The kind that men kill for," he said with the casual matter-of-factness that only children could manage when discussing such weighty matters. Marcus looked out over his ranch, his sanctuary that had suddenly become the center of something much larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening heavens. "Your mother," he said slowly, "where is she now?" The twins exchanged another of their silent conversations, their identical faces reflecting an inner debate that seemed to involve more than words could convey. Finally the first twin spoke. "She's hiding," he said quietly, "in a place where even the bell can't reach her, but she's alive, and she's waiting for us to find her." "And you think I can help with that?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. The letter in his pocket, Elena's words about trusting the boys, the supernatural protection they'd just demonstrated, it all pointed to a responsibility he'd never asked for, but couldn't ignore. The second twin nodded solemnly. "Mama said you were the only one who'd believe us," he said. "The only one who'd understand what the mine really means." Marcus thought about his great-grandfather Jedediah, the family stories that had always seemed too fantastic to be true. Stories about lights in the desert, about a mine that gave up its treasures only to those it deemed worthy, about a legacy that was more than just money or land. "Tell me about the bell," he said, settling back in his chair for what he suspected would be a very long night. The twin holding the chicken smiled and gently touched the brass surface. "Mama found it in the deepest part of the mine," he began, his young voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. "It was just sitting there on a shelf of rock, like someone had placed it there yesterday instead of 100 years ago. When she picked it up," the second twin continued, "it started to sing, not loud, but like it was happy to finally have someone to talk to." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Talk to?" The first twin nodded seriously. "The bell remembers everything," he explained. "Every person who's ever touched it, every secret it's ever heard, and it remembers your great-grandfather most of all." The implications of that statement settled over Marcus like a heavy. If the bell truly retained memories, if it had been Jedediah's companion in those long-ago prospecting days, then it might hold the key to understanding what his ancestor had really discovered in the desert. "What does it remember about Jedediah?" Marcus asked, leaning forward in his chair. The twins looked at each other, then at the chicken, which had begun to doze in the boy's arms. The bell hung quiet and still around its neck, but Marcus could swear he saw a faint glimmer of golden light deep within the brass surface. "It remembers the day he found the heart of the mountain," the second twin said softly, "and the promise he made to keep it safe." "The heart of the mountain," Marcus repeated. "What's that?" But before the twins could answer, the sound of vehicles approaching cut through the night air once again. Multiple engines this time, moving fast and with purpose. Marcus stood quickly, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle he kept mounted above his front door. "More agents?" he asked tersely. The twins were on their feet as well, the chicken now fully alert and clucking with agitation. The bell began to chime again, but this time the sound was different, urgent and warning rather than protective. "Worse," the first twin said, his face pale in the porch light. "These are the ones who took Mama." Marcus grabbed his rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. "How many?" The second twin closed his eyes, as if listening to something only he could hear. The bell's chiming grew more insistent, and the chicken began to glow again, its golden light casting strange shadows across the porch. "6, he said after a moment. "6 men with guns and equipment. They're not here to ask questions." Marcus felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd had years ago when he'd faced down cattle rustlers trying to steal his herd. But this was different. This time he wasn't just protecting his property, he was protecting Elena's children, children who might be his own, though he hadn't yet found the courage to ask that question directly. "Can the bell stop them like it did the agents?" he asked. The twins shook their heads in unison. "These men know about the bell," the first twin explained. "They have protection against its power." "Then we run," Marcus decided, his mind already planning their escape route. He knew every inch of his property, every hidden trail and secret path. If they could make it to the old line shack in the back pasture, they could hold out until dawn, maybe longer. But the second twin caught his arm as he moved toward the steps. "We can't run," he said urgently. "Not yet. The bell has to do something first." "What?" Marcus demanded, hearing the vehicles getting closer. Their headlights were visible now, cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. The twin holding the chicken stepped to the edge, the bird's golden glow intensifying until it was like holding a small sun. The bell's chiming reached a crescendo, and suddenly the night was filled with a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, a deep resonant hum that made Marcus's bones vibrate. "It's calling," the first twin said, his voice filled with awe and terror. "Calling to the others." "What others?" Marcus asked, but even as the words left his mouth he began to understand. The glow from the chicken was spreading, touching the fence posts, the barn, the very ground beneath their feet, and wherever the light touched, an answering glow began to emerge from the earth itself. The mine. The bell was calling to whatever remained in Jedediah's mine, whatever power source Elena had discovered and tried to protect, and that power was answering the call. The approaching vehicles suddenly swerved and stopped, their occupants apparently as surprised by the phenomenon as Marcus was. Shouts echoed across the night air, voices sharp with confusion and fear. "Now we run," the second twin said, grabbing Marcus's hand with surprising strength for such a small child. The mine will keep them busy, but not for long. Marcus took one last look at his ranch, at the home he'd shared with Catherine and the peaceful sanctuary it had been until today. Then he followed the twins into the darkness, carrying nothing but his rifle and the growing certainty that his life had just taken a turn, from which there would be no going back. Behind them the golden light continued to spread, and the sound of the mine's awakening filled the night like the breathing of some vast ancient creature. Whatever Elena had discovered, whatever secret Jediah had died protecting, it was about to change everything. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, the bell continued to chime, leading them toward a destiny that Marcus was only beginning to understand. The old line shack crouched against the hillside like a forgotten prayer, its weathered boards silvered by moonlight and decades of desert wind. Marcus pushed open the door, grateful that he'd maintained this remote shelter over the years despite Catherine's gentle teasing about his doomsday preparations. The musty smell of disuse greeted them, along with the scurrying sounds of small creatures disturbed from their nocturnal activities. The twins entered behind him, the chicken still glowing faintly in the first boy's arms, though the intensity had diminished during their 2-hour trek across the back pasture. The bell around the bird's neck chimed softly with each step, but the urgent warning tone had faded to something more like a lullaby. Marcus struck a match and lit the kerosene lantern that hung from a hook near the door, casting dancing shadows across the small interior. The shack contained the basics of survival: canned goods stacked on rough shelves, a hand pump for the well outside, wool blankets folded on the single cot, and most importantly, a CB radio that Marcus had installed years ago for emergencies. The twins settled onto the floor, with the kind of weary grace that suggested they were accustomed to finding rest in unlikely places. Marcus cranked the CB radio to life, the static crackling through the small space like electronic rainfall. He'd maintained contact with other ranchers in the area for years, sharing information about weather, livestock, and the occasional emergency. Now he hoped that network might provide information about the men who were hunting Elena's children. Red Canyon Base, this is Thornfield Ranch, over. He spoke into the microphone, using the call signs he'd established with his neighbor Jake Morrison, whose spread lay 20 miles to the south.
The response came through heavy static. Marcus, that you? Hell, we haven't heard from you in months. Everything all right out there? Jake, I need you to listen carefully, Marcus said, glancing at the twins who were watching him with their unsettling intensity. I've got federal agents or men claiming to be federal agents on my property. They're after some children, and I don't think their intentions are legal. A long pause filled with static, then Jake's voice returned, more serious now. Federal agents? What kind of agents? And what children? Marcus hesitated, unsure how much to reveal over an open channel. The twins sensed his uncertainty, and the first boy stood, approaching the radio with the chicken still cradled in his arms. Let me, the boy said quietly, his young voice carrying an authority that seemed beyond his years. Marcus handed him the microphone, curious to see what the child would say. Mr. Morrison, the twin spoke clearly into the device. This is Samuel Vasquez. My brother David and I are Elena Vasquez's sons. Men took our mama 3 days ago, and now they're trying to take us too. Mr. Thornfield is protecting us, but we need help. The static seemed to intensify for a moment, then Jake's voice returned with a new urgency. Elena Vasquez. Jesus, Marcus, Elena's back. Where has she been all these years? You know Elena? Marcus asked, taking the microphone back from Samuel. Know her? Hell, Marcus. She's been living on the old Peterson place for the past 6 months. Keeps to herself mostly, but she's been asking questions around town about mining records and geological surveys. Some folks thought she might be working for one of those big energy companies. Marcus felt the world shift again, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Elena had been living less than 30 miles away, and he'd never known. The Peterson place was an abandoned homestead that had been empty for years, the kind of property that attracted squatters and folks who needed to stay off the official radar. Jake, I need you to spread the word quietly, Marcus said. These men aren't legitimate federal agents, they're dangerous, and they're willing to hurt children to get what they want. If anyone sees black SUVs or men in suits asking questions, they need to stay away and call the sheriff. Already on it, Jake replied. And Marcus, be careful.
There have been helicopters flying search patterns over the desert for the past 2 days. Military-looking birds, no markings. Something big is happening out there. The radio fell silent, except for static, and Marcus turned to find both twins watching him with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. Samuel still held the chicken, which had settled into a comfortable doze, despite the circumstances. The bell around its neck caught the lantern light, throwing brief sparkles across the rough wooden walls. "Your mama's been living at the Peterson place," Marcus said gently. "Did you know she was so close?" David, the twin who'd been quiet during the radio exchange, shook his head. "She moved us around a lot," he explained. "Never stayed anywhere more than a few weeks, but she always talked about coming home to Millbrook eventually. She was gathering information," Samuel added, adjusting the chicken's position in his lap. "Learning about the old mining claims, the geological surveys, the accident that killed your father and the other miners." Marcus felt his chest tighten at the mention of his father's death. Thomas Thornfield had been one of the 8 men who died in the mine collapse 20 years ago, a tragedy that had haunted the community ever since. The official report had blamed unstable geological conditions and outdated safety equipment, but there had always been whispers about what the miners had really been digging for in those final weeks. "What did she find out about the accident?" Marcus asked, settling onto a crate across from the boys. The twins exchanged one of their silent conversations, entire paragraphs of meaning passing between them in the space of a few seconds. Finally Samuel spoke, his young voice heavy with knowledge that no child should care. "It wasn't an accident," he said simply. "The miners found something in the deepest tunnel, something that changed everything. Your great-grandfather's original claim was just the beginning. The real discovery was much bigger." David leaned forward, his blue eyes reflecting the lantern's flame. "Mama found records that the mining company tried to destroy, financial documents, geological reports, witness statements from the survivors. She spent months piecing it together." "What kind of discovery?" Marcus pressed, though he was beginning to suspect the answer would challenge everything he thought he knew about his family's history. Samuel gently stroked the chicken's feathers, causing the bell to chime softly. At the sound, the bird opened its eyes, and Marcus saw that golden glow beginning to intensify again. But this time, instead of the protective radiance they'd witnessed earlier, the light seemed to be forming images in the air above the chicken's head. The images were hazy at first, like looking through desert heat shimmer, but they gradually solidified into recognizable shapes. Marcus found himself staring at what appeared to be a moving photograph of the desert, viewed from somewhere high above the ground. The perspective shifted, and swooped, as if the observer was flying over the landscape at tremendous speed. "The bell remembers," David said softly. "Everything it's ever seen, everyone it's ever known. Mama taught us how to ask it to share its memories." The aerial view in the golden light began to focus on a specific area of the desert, a region Marcus recognized as the old mining district, where his great-grandfather had once worked his claims. But the landscape in the vision looked different from the barren, played-out area he knew today. Rivers flowed where now there was only dry stone, and vegetation covered the hills in a green carpet that spoke of abundant water and rich soil. "This is what the desert looked like 150 years ago," Samuel explained, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced guide, leading tourists through a museum. "Before the mining companies came, before they found what was buried beneath the sand." The vision shifted, and dove toward the earth, passing through rock and soil, as if they were made of mist. Marcus felt his stomach lurch with the disorienting sensation of flight, even though he remained seated on his crate in the lined shack. The golden light carried them deeper underground, through layers of sedimentary rock and mineral deposits, until they reached a vast cavern that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of vision. The cavern was filled with light, but not the artificial illumination of electric bulbs or gas lamps. This light came from the walls themselves, from crystalline formations that pulsed with a gentle rhythmic glow like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. The crystals were beautiful beyond description, their faceted surfaces throwing rainbows across the cavern walls and ceiling in patterns that seemed almost alive. "The heart of the mountain," David whispered, and Marcus understood that they were seeing what his great-grandfather had discovered, all those years ago. This was the source of the Thornfield family fortune, the secret that Jediah had taken to his grave. But the vision wasn't finished. The perspective pulled back to show the cavern in its entirety, and Marcus gasped at what he saw. The crystalline formations weren't random geological accidents. They formed patterns, almost like circuits or pathways, all leading toward a central formation that rose from the cavern floor like a natural altar. On that altar sat an object that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was a bell, identical to the one around the chicken's neck, but larger and more ornate. Ancient symbols were carved into its brass surface, symbols that seemed to shift and change even as he watched. And surrounding the bell were dozens of smaller objects, tools, weapons, jewelry, and other artifacts that spoke of human presence dating back far longer than any recorded history of the region. "Your great-grandfather wasn't the first to find the cavern," Samuel said, his young voice filled with awe and sadness. "People have been coming to the heart of the mountain for thousands of years. The bell was their gift to the mountain, their way of asking permission to take what they needed." The vision began to fade, the golden light dimming as the chicken settled back into sleep. But the images remained burned into Marcus's memory, challenging everything he thought he knew about his family's past and the land he'd called home his entire life. "The mining companies didn't understand," David continued, picking up the narrative where his brother had left off. "They saw the crystals as just another mineral deposit to be extracted and sold. They didn't realize that the formations were alive, that they were part of something much larger and more important than mere wealth." Marcus struggled to process what he'd seen and heard. "You're saying the crystals are alive?" The twins nodded in unison, their serious expressions conveying the weight of ancient knowledge. "Not alive like animals or plants," Samuel clarified, "but alive like the earth itself is alive. They're connected to everything, the water table, the soil, the plants and animals that live in the desert. When the mining companies started blasting and digging, they were destroying a system that had been in balance for millennia. And that's what caused the mine collapse," David added. "The mountain was trying to protect itself." The implications of their words settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. If what the boys were telling him was true, then his father's death hadn't been caused by corporate negligence or outdated safety equipment. It had been the result of something far more complex and terrible, the death throes of a living system that had been violated beyond its ability to endure. "Elena discovered all of this through her research?" Marcus asked. "She discovered much more than that," Samuel said grimly. "She found out that the mining companies never really left. They've been monitoring the site for 20 years, waiting for the right time to return and finish what they started." A chill ran down Marcus's spine. "Return? But the mines have been sealed, the whole area is posted as dangerous." David shook his head. "The seals are fake, just enough to keep away casual explorers and treasure hunters. The real operation is hidden underground, accessed through tunnels that connect to the old mine system." "What kind of operation?" Marcus demanded, though he was beginning to fear the answer. The twins looked at each other, then at the sleeping chicken with its mysterious bell. When they spoke again, it was in unison, their voices blending into a single chilling statement. "They're trying to wake up the mountain." Before Marcus could ask what that meant, the sound of helicopters filled the night air. The mechanical thunder grew rapidly closer, accompanied by the whine of high-powered engines and the distinctive thump of rotor blades cutting through the desert silence. "They found us," Samuel said, clutching the chicken closer to his chest. The bird woke immediately, its eyes beginning to glow with that protective golden light. Marcus moved to the small window, peering through the gap in the boards to see searchlights sweeping across the landscape. 3 helicopters approached from different directions, their coordinated movement, speaking of military precision and unlimited resources. "How?" he asked, though he was already moving toward the emergency supplies he kept in a locked cabinet. "We didn't leave a trail they could follow." David pointed to the chicken, whose bell was now chiming with increasing urgency. "The bell calls to the mountain, but it also calls to the other bells. If they have one of the ancient bells from the cavern, they can track us." Marcus grabbed his emergency pack, checking its contents: water purification tablets, energy bars, first aid supplies, and most importantly, a handheld GPS unit that would help them navigate the desert in darkness. "We need to move again. Is there somewhere they can't track the bell?" Samuel stood, the chicken secure in his arms, despite its agitation. "The old Spanish mission," he said without hesitation, 20 miles south, built on sacred ground. "The mountain's power is different there, older. It might be enough to hide us." "The mission's been abandoned for 50 years, Marcus protested. "There's nothing there but ruins." "That's what makes it perfect," David replied, moving toward the door with the quick efficiency of a child accustomed to flight. "And besides, Mama might be there." She mentioned it in her letters, said it was a place where the old powers still held sway. The helicopters were close enough now that Marcus could hear voices over their loudspeakers, commands barked in military cadence that left no doubt about their intentions.
The line shack would be discovered within minutes, and unlike the ranch house, there was nowhere to run from this isolated position, unless they went underground. Marcus had explored these hills as a boy, discovering caves and hidden passages that honeycombed the rock formations. Most were too small or unstable to be useful, but there was one tunnel system that connected to the old mine workings. It would be dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it might be their only chance. There's a cave entrance about 50 yards up the hill, he told the twins, shouldering his pack and checking his rifle. It connects to the mine tunnels. We can use them to get past the search teams. Samuel's eyes widened with fear, but also with something that might have been excitement. Into the mountain. But Mama said never to go underground, that it was too dangerous. Everything's dangerous now, Marcus replied grimly. But at least in the tunnels, we'll be on the mountain's home ground. Maybe that will give us an advantage. The helicopters had found the line shack, their searchlights turning night into harsh, artificial day. Rappelling ropes dropped from the aircraft, and dark figures began their descent with practiced efficiency. Marcus counted at least 12 men, all armed and equipped for serious combat. Move, he ordered, leading the twins toward the back of the shack and the hidden door he'd installed years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. The narrow passage beyond led up the hillside, concealed by carefully positioned rocks and scrub brush. They climbed quickly but carefully, Marcus's knowledge of the terrain guiding them through the darkness while the helicopters maintained their hover over the now empty line shack. Behind them, powerful lights swept the area as the search teams realized their quarry had escaped. The cave entrance was little more than a crack in the rock face, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Marcus had discovered it during a childhood adventure, part of his endless exploration of the family ranch. He'd never told anyone about it, not even Catherine, keeping it as a secret refuge that belonged only to him. Now it might save all their lives. The chicken began to glow more brightly as they approached the cave, its golden radiance illuminating the narrow opening. The bell around its neck chimed with a different tone now, no longer urgent or warning, but almost welcoming. It was as if the bird recognized something about this place, some connection to the larger mystery they were all part of. The mountain knows we're coming, David said softly, his hand trailing along the rock wall as they entered the cave. It's been waiting for us. The tunnel beyond the entrance was larger than Marcus remembered, carved from solid rock by forces he couldn't begin to understand. The walls were smooth and curved, following natural fault lines that created a path deeper into the heart of the mountain. And everywhere, just at the edge of perception, there was a faint luminescence that seemed to respond to the chicken's glow. The crystals, Samuel breathed, pointing to tiny formations that dotted the tunnel walls like stars in an underground sky. They're singing. Marcus paused to listen, and realized the boy was right. There was a sound in the tunnel, barely audible but definitely present, a harmonic resonance that seemed to come from the rock itself. It was hauntingly beautiful, like a choir of voices singing in a language he couldn't understand but somehow recognized. How far do these tunnels go? David asked, his young voice echoing in the stone passage. I don't know, Marcus admitted. I never explored them fully as a kid, but if they connect to the old mine system like I think they do, they could take us anywhere in the mountain. They walked in single file, Marcus leading with his rifle ready, the twins following with the chicken providing their only light. The tunnel branched and twisted, sometimes opening into larger chambers filled with crystal formations, sometimes narrowing to passages barely wide enough for a single person. And always, the singing grew stronger. After an hour of steady walking, they emerged into a cavern that took Marcus's breath away. It was smaller than the vast space they'd seen in the bell's vision, but no less beautiful. Crystals covered every surface, their faceted faces reflecting the chicken's glow and amplifying it into a cathedral of light and color. But what stopped Marcus in his tracks wasn't the beauty of the crystals. It was the evidence of human presence scattered throughout the cavern. Camping equipment, scientific instruments, and most disturbing of all, the remnants of what appeared to be military hardware. Someone's been using this place as a base, he said grimly, examining a portable generator that still held fuel in its tank. Samuel set the chicken down gently, allowing it to explore the cavern floor while remaining close enough to provide protection. The bird seemed to know exactly where it was, moving with purpose toward a particular section of the crystal wall. They're trying to map the mountain's nervous system, David said, pointing to charts and diagrams pinned to a makeshift bulletin board. Look at these readings. Marcus studied the documents, his understanding limited but his concern growing. The papers showed electromagnetic readings, seismic measurements, and what appeared to be attempts to chart the flow of some kind of energy through the mountain's crystal formations. They're not just trying to wake up the mountain, he realized with growing horror. They're trying to control it. A new sound echoed through the cavern, not the harmonious singing of the crystals, but the harsh mechanical noise of drilling equipment. Somewhere in the tunnels ahead, someone was working with heavy machinery, boring deeper into the mountain's heart. The chicken suddenly spread its wings and crowed, a sound that echoed through the cavern like a battle cry. The bell around its neck began to chime rapidly, and the crystals responded by flaring with brilliant light that made the golden radiance look pale by comparison. They know we're here, Samuel said, scooping up the bird and holding it protectively against his chest. And now the mountain knows they're here too. The drilling sound stopped abruptly, replaced by shouting voices and the clatter of equipment being hastily moved. Marcus grabbed as many of the documents as he could carry, stuffing them into his pack while the twins prepared to move deeper into the tunnel system. "Where now?" he asked, looking to the boys for guidance. They seemed to understand the mountain's geography in ways that defied explanation, as if the Bell's memories had become their own. David pointed toward a passage that led upward, following a vein of crystal that pulsed with regular rhythm. "That way leads to the old Spanish mission," he said with certainty. "But we have to hurry. The drilling damaged something important, and the mountain is getting angry." As if to emphasize his words, a tremor ran through the cavern, causing dust to fall from the ceiling and the crystals to ring like wind chimes in a storm. The sound was beautiful and terrible, a harmony that spoke of power beyond human comprehension. Marcus shouldered his pack and checked his rifle, then looked at the two boys who had turned his quiet life of grief into an adventure that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. "Lead the way," he said simply. "Let's go find your mother." They entered the upward passage as another tremor shook the mountain, stronger this time and accompanied by a sound like distant thunder. Behind them, the abandoned military equipment began to spark and smoke as the mountain's electromagnetic field fluctuated wildly. The hunt was far from over, but now they were no longer just the hunted. They were part of something larger, something that had been sleeping beneath the desert for far longer than recorded history. And that something was beginning to wake up. The bell chimed once more, a sound that seemed to echo not just through the tunnels but through time itself, calling to powers that predated human civilization and connecting past, present, and future in ways that would change everything. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and the desert held its breath as the mountain began to remember what it had once been, and what it was destined to become once again. The old Spanish mission rose from the desert floor like a monument to forgotten prayers, its adobe walls crumbling but still proud against the dawn sky. Marcus emerged from the tunnel system with the twins, grateful to breathe fresh air after hours in the mountain's crystalline depths. The chicken in Samuel's arms had guided them through passages that seemed to shift and change according to some ancient logic, leading them safely past the military teams that had flooded the underground chambers. Elena stood in the mission's central courtyard, her dark hair streaked with premature silver and her clothes bearing the dust of weeks in hiding. She turned at the sound of their approach, and Marcus felt 15 years collapse into nothing as their eyes met across the sacred space. "You came," she said simply, her voice carrying the same musical quality that had haunted his dreams through all the years of silence. The twins rushed to their mother, the chicken squawking in protest as Samuel nearly dropped it in his eagerness to embrace Elena. She gathered both boys to her, tears streaming down her face as she whispered words of relief and love in a mixture of English and Spanish that spoke of sleepless nights and desperate hope. "The bell brought them," David said, extricating himself from his mother's arms to show her the still glowing chicken. "It remembered everything, just like you said it would." Elena's eyes widened as she saw the radiance emanating from the bird, a golden light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with something deep beneath the mission's foundation. "It's stronger now," she murmured, reaching out to gently touch the brass bell around the chicken's neck. "The mountain has accepted them." "Elena," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "We need to talk. About the boys. About what you've discovered. About what those people want." She looked at him with eyes that held too much knowledge and too much sorrow. "I know what you're wondering, Marcus. And yes, they're yours. I should have told you years ago, but I was young and proud and afraid of what it would mean for all of us." The simple confirmation hit Marcus like a physical blow, even though he'd suspected the truth since the moment the twins had appeared on his porch. These serious, extraordinary children were his sons, products of a love that had burned too bright and ended too soon. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, though the anger he expected to feel was overwhelmed by a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "Because I knew what would happen," Elena replied, settling onto a broken stone bench with the twins flanking her like small guards. "I knew that if you learned about them you'd never let them go, and I needed them to be free, Marcus, free to choose their own path, free from the destiny that's been haunting our families for generations." "What destiny?" Marcus demanded, though he was beginning to suspect the answer involved the mountain's secrets and the bells that connected past and present in ways that defied understanding. Elena gestured toward the chicken, which had begun to explore the courtyard with the confident air of a creature returning to familiar territory. "The bells are keys, Marcus, keys to a power that's been sleeping beneath the desert for thousands of years. My ancestors knew about it, your great-grandfather discovered it, and now the government wants to weaponize it." The chicken paused near what appeared to be an old well in the center of the courtyard, its head tilted as if listening to something only it could hear. The bell around its neck chimed once, a clear note that seemed to awaken echoes from the mission stones themselves. "The Spanish missionaries built this place on a sacred site," Elena continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing carefully preserved oral history. "They thought they were claiming it for their god, but the indigenous people knew better. They let the missionaries build here because they understood that some places are bigger than any single faith." Marcus watched the chicken as it began to scratch at the ground near the old well, its movements purposeful and deliberate. "The boys said you were in danger, that men had taken you." Elena's expression darkened. "They tried to take me. Corporate mercenaries working for interests that go far beyond simple mining rights. But I'd prepared for that possibility. The boys knew what to do, where to go, who to trust. They trusted me," Marcus said quietly, "but I'm not sure I deserve that trust. I don't understand what's happening, Elena. I don't understand what these bells really are or why they matter so much." Samuel looked up from where he'd been watching the chicken's excavation efforts, Show him, Mama. Show him what the mountain remembers. Elena hesitated, glancing at the eastern horizon where the sun was beginning to paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The morning feeding time, she murmured. Yes, perhaps it's time he understood everything. She moved to the old well, kneeling beside the chicken as it continued its determined digging. The bird had uncovered something metallic, a curved surface that caught the early sunlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Another bell, Marcus breathed, understanding flooding through him as the pieces of the puzzle finally began to form a complete picture. The master bell, Elena confirmed, carefully brushing dirt away from the ancient artifact. The one that all the others were made to harmonize with. The Spanish missionaries found it here and built their mission around it, not knowing what they were really protecting. The bell was larger than the one around the chicken's neck, its brass surface covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the morning light. As Elena lifted it from its earthen resting place, a sound began to emanate from deep underground, a harmonic resonance that made the very stones of the mission vibrate. When it rings at feeding time, David said solemnly, completing the phrase that had started their entire adventure, everything changes. Elena looked at Marcus with eyes that held both love and terrible knowledge. The mountain has been sleeping for 20 years, ever since the mining accident killed your father and the others. But it's been dreaming, Marcus, dreaming of the day when the bells would be reunited, and the old compact could be renewed. What compact? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The agreement between the mountain and the people who live in its shadow, Elena replied, holding the master bell carefully in both hands. Protection in exchange for guardianship, power in exchange for responsibility. Your great-grandfather understood it, which is why he hid the smaller bell and sealed the deepest mines. He knew that some powers are too great to be exploited. The chicken had stopped its digging and now stood perfectly still, its golden glow intensifying as the master bell's vibrations grew stronger.
The two artifacts seemed to be calling to each other across the space that separated them, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying in its implications. The government knows about the compact, Elena continued. They've been studying the old records, the indigenous oral traditions, the missionary reports. They think they can break the mountain's defenses and claim its power for themselves. And can they? Marcus asked, dreading the answer. Elena's smile was grim. They can try. But the mountain chooses its own guardians, and it's been waiting for the right family to accept the responsibility. The Thornfield family, your family, Marcus. The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the morning air, their mechanical thunder growing louder as they closed in on the mission's location. Marcus counted at least 6 aircraft, more than had pursued them from the ranch, suggesting that their underground journey had triggered a massive mobilization of resources. They tracked us here, he said, reaching for his rifle. No, Elena replied calmly, standing with the master bell still cradled in her hands. I called them here. It's time to end this, one way or another. The twins moved to stand beside their parents, forming a family circle around the chicken as it began to glow with increasing intensity. The bird spread its wings and crowed, a sound that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality, calling to powers that had slept beneath the desert for far too long. The helicopters began their descent, kicking up clouds of dust that obscured the mission's courtyard. Marcus could see rappelling ropes being deployed, armed figures preparing to storm their refuge with overwhelming force. Elena, he said urgently. What are you planning? She looked at him with eyes that held all the love they'd never had time to express, all the years they'd spent apart, and all the hope for a future they might never see. I'm planning to give our sons the choice I never had, she said simply. The choice to accept their heritage
or walk away from it forever.
The master bell began to ring, its deep resonant tone seeming to come from the earth itself rather than the brass artifact in Elena's hands. The chicken answered with its own bell, the two sounds weaving together in a harmony that made the air itself seem to shimmer and dance, and then the mountain began to wake up. The ground beneath the mission started to glow, soft at first but growing brighter with each passing second. Lines of light spread outward from the old well, following patterns that had been carved into the stone foundation by hands that had worked centuries before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing west. The approaching soldiers stopped their descent, their confident assault becoming confused retreat as the very air around the mission began to pulse with energy that their instruments couldn't measure, and their training hadn't prepared them to face. Choose, Elena said to the twins, her voice somehow audible over the growing crescendo of the bells. Accept the guardianship and everything it means, or walk away and live normal lives, but choose now, while the mountain is listening. Samuel and David looked at each other, having one of their silent conversations that seemed to encompass entire lifetimes of shared experience. Then they looked at Marcus, their father, the man who'd protected them without question and followed them into dangers he couldn't understand. We choose family, Samuel said simply, reaching out to take Marcus's hand. We choose responsibility, David added, grasping Elena's free hand to complete their circle. the chicken crowed once more, and the mountain answered with a voice that had been silent for 20 years. Light erupted from every crystal formation in the underground caverns, turning the desert above into a landscape of impossible beauty. The helicopters retreated rapidly, their sophisticated equipment failing in the presence of forces that predated human technology by millennia. Marcus felt power flow through him, ancient knowledge that connected him to his great-grandfather and all the guardians who had come before. He understood now why Jediah had hidden the bell, why the indigenous people had built their sacred sites here, why the mountain had chosen this moment to reveal its true nature. "The compact is renewed," Elena said, her voice carrying across the desert as the master bell's song reached its crescendo. "The mountain sleeps in peace, and we stand watch over its dreams." The light began to fade, the harmonic resonance settling into a gentle hum that spoke of power held in careful balance. The helicopters had disappeared entirely, their crews no doubt reporting equipment failures and unexplained phenomena that would be buried in classified files and forgotten. Marcus looked at his family, his sons and the woman he'd never stopped loving despite all the years and pain that had separated them. They stood in the mission courtyard, as the sun climbed higher, ordinary people who'd been chosen for an extraordinary responsibility. "What happens now?" he asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. Elena smiled, the first truly happy expression he'd seen on her face since their reunion. "Now we go home," she said simply. "All of us, together." The chicken pecked contentedly at the ground, its bell chiming softly in the morning breeze. Above them, the desert sky stretched endlessly blue, holding secrets that would remain safe for another generation. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, the mountain settled back into its ancient dreams, secure in the knowledge that the compact had been renewed, and the guardians had returned to their posts. The bell that had started their adventure continued to ring softly, no longer a call to action but a gentle reminder that some promises transcend time itself, connecting past and future in the eternal now of family, love and sacred responsibility. They walked together toward the rising sun, 4 people and 1 extraordinary chicken, carrying the weight of guardianship and the joy of reunion in equal measure. The desert stretched before them, no longer empty but full of possibilities that only they could see, guided by the gentle chiming of a bell that had finally found its way home. 6 months later, Marcus stood on his rebuilt porch watching Samuel and David chase Henrietta around the yard, their laughter mixing with the chickens' indignant squawks as they played their daily game of keep-away. The brass bell around the bird's neck chimed merrily with each hop and flutter, no longer the mystical instrument of ancient power but simply part of their everyday soundtrack. Elena emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands on the apron that had once belonged to Catherine. She'd asked Marcus's permission before wearing it, understanding the delicate balance between honoring the past and embracing the future. The gesture had moved him more than any grand declaration could have. "Coffee's ready," she announced, settling into the chair beside his that had sat empty for 3 long years, and the boys finished their correspondence lessons for the day. Marcus nodded, still marveling at how naturally she'd slipped back into his life, filling spaces he hadn't even realized were hollow. The boys had adapted with the resilience of children, treating their newfound father with a mixture of curiosity and acceptance that humbled him daily. "Any word from Jake about the mining surveys?" Elena asked, referring to the legitimate geological team that had arrived 2 weeks ago to assess the mountain's stability after the seismic events that had shaken the region. "All clear," Marcus replied, unable to suppress a smile. "Apparently the rock formations have reached a new equilibrium. No further drilling recommended due to, quote, unpredictable electromagnetic anomalies, unquote." Elena laughed, a sound that still caught his breath after all these months. The mountain has a sense of humor. The official explanation for the lights and tremors had been remarkably creative, involving everything from underground gas pockets to rare mineral deposits that created unusual electromagnetic fields. The military teams had vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, their classified reports buried so deep that even Freedom of Information requests would never uncover them. Occasionally, government vehicles still patrolled the area, but they maintained a respectful distance from the Thornfield ranch. It was as if an unspoken agreement had been reached. The mountain would remain quiet, and in return, the family would be left in peace. "Daddy, look what Henrietta found," David called out, running toward the porch with something cupped in his small hands. The chicken followed behind him, her bell chiming a proud little tune. Marcus leaned forward as David opened his hands to reveal a small crystal, no bigger than a marble but perfectly formed and glowing with a soft inner light. It pulsed gently,
like a tiny heartbeat made of stone. She dug it up near the old oak tree, Samuel added, arriving breathless from his pursuit of both chicken and brother. It was just sitting there in the dirt, like it was waiting for us to find it. Elena examined the crystal carefully, her expression thoughtful. Over the months, they'd all learned to recognize the mountain's gifts, small tokens that appeared whenever the family needed guidance or reassurance. Never anything dramatic or overtly magical, just gentle reminders that they weren't alone in their guardianship. "What do you think it means?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to understand the mountain's language of symbols and signs. "I think," Elena said, closing David's hands gently around the crystal, "it means the mountain approves of the addition we're planning to the house." The addition. Marcus felt his heart skip as he thought about the third bedroom they'd been designing, the nursery that would soon be needed. Elena was 3 months along, though they'd only confirmed it the week before during a trip to the town doctor. "A baby sister," Samuel said with the certainty of a child who'd already decided how the world should work. "Or brother," David countered, though his tone suggested he was equally pleased with either possibility. "Either way," Elena said, standing to gather both boys into her arms, "they'll have the best big brothers in Texas." Marcus watched his family, still amazed by the path that had led them all back together. The crystal in David's hand pulsed once more, then settled into a steady, gentle glow that spoke of approval and blessing from forces older than memory. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and amber. Soon it would be evening, time for the family ritual they'd established over the months, dinner together on the porch, stories shared as the stars emerged, and the gentle lullaby of Henrietta's bell as she settled into her roost. "I should start supper," Elena said, but she made no move to leave the circle of Marcus's arms. "In a minute," he replied, content to hold this moment a little longer. "Jake's bringing his family over for barbecue tomorrow. First time we've had company since everything changed," Elena finished, understanding what he couldn't quite put into words. The transformation had been gradual but profound. Word had spread through the community about Marcus's return to social life, about the woman and children who'd brought him back from his grief-induced isolation. Invitations had begun arriving, tentative at first, but growing more confident as people realized that the old Marcus was still there beneath the layers of sorrow and mystery. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday while you were checking the fence line," Elena mentioned casually. "She brought a casserole, and about a dozen questions about our wedding plans." Marcus chuckled. "And what did you tell her? That we're taking things one day at a time?" Elena replied diplomatically. "But I may have mentioned that the boys would look very handsome in their Sunday best." The wedding was still being planned, though they'd already committed to each other in every way that mattered. The ceremony would be simple, held right here on the ranch with the community as witnesses. Pastor Williams had agreed to officiate, despite his admitted confusion about the family's unconventional history. "The mountain will want to be involved," Samuel said, matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "It likes celebrations." "How do you know that?" Marcus asked, though he'd learned to take his son's insights seriously. David held up the crystal, which was now pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost musical. "It told us, not in words but we understand." Elena exchanged a meaningful look with Marcus. The boy's connection to the mountain had grown stronger over the months, manifesting in small ways that might have been dismissed as childhood imagination if their parents hadn't known better. They could predict weather changes days in advance, always knew when the water table was shifting, and had an uncanny ability to find lost objects anywhere on the ranch. "Well then," Marcus said, making a decision that felt as natural as breathing, "I suppose we should ask the mountain what kind of flowers it prefers for weddings." The twins grinned with delight, already planning their consultation with the ancient intelligence that had become as much a part of their daily life as morning chores and evening prayers. As the sun continued its descent, Marcus reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been a broken man counting down his days in solitude. Now he was part of something larger than himself, connected to powers and responsibilities that stretched back through generations. The old government interest in the mountain had faded, replaced by newer concerns and different crises. Officially, the area remained under environmental protection, its unusual properties attributed to unique geological formations that required careful study. Unofficially, the right people understood that some places were better left undisturbed. "Time for chores," Elena announced, practical as always despite the magical undercurrents of their life. Boys, go gather the eggs, and make sure Henrietta gets her evening grain. Samuel and David scampered off, the crystal safely tucked in David's pocket, and Henrietta strutting behind them like a feathered supervisor. Her bell chimed with each step, a sound that had become as familiar and comforting as any lullaby. Marcus and Elena remained on the porch, content to watch their children tend to their responsibilities with the seriousness that had marked them from their first appearance at his door. The mountain's influence had given them wisdom beyond their years, but they were still children, still capable of wonder and joy, and the simple pleasure of caring for a magical chicken. No regrets, Elena asked softly, her hand finding his as they sat in comfortable silence. None, Marcus replied without hesitation. Whatever comes next, whatever the mountain asks of us, we'll face it together. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same constellations that had watched over the desert for millennia. Somewhere beneath their feet, the mountain dreamed its ancient dreams, secure in the knowledge that its guardians were in place and its secrets were safe. The bell chimed once more from the direction of the chicken coop, a gentle good night that seemed to echo across the vast expanse of Texas sky. Marcus squeezed Elena's hand, gathered his family's laughter into his heart, and settled in to watch the stars emerge one by one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries, and new reasons to marvel at the extraordinary path their lives had taken. But tonight, on this perfect evening in early autumn, they were simply a family blessed by forces they might never fully understand, but would always honor. The mountains slept, the stars shone, and the bell's gentle song carried promises of love, protection, and the enduring power of family across the infinite desert night. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.